Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ken Yalowitz. I'm the director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding. And I can see by the size of the crowd today and the hour in which everyone came that all of you know this is going to be a very special occasion today. Before I introduce our speaker, Sarah Chayes, I would like to recognize some individuals who are really important in terms of making this visit possible. And first and foremost, I would like to thank Bill Obenshane and his wonderful wife, Penny. Bill is from the class of 1962. They have endowed this Great Issues lecture. And I also want to thank them for their continued support and assistance to Dartmouth and the Dickey Center. And please, let's recognize them. The Great Issues lectures are quarterly events that provide opportunities for the Dartmouth community to examine some of the most pressing issues of our day. And these lectures are inspired by the Great Issues course started by former Dartmouth president John Sloan Dickey, for whom the Dickey Center for International Understanding is named. Today's lecture indeed deals with a vital and pressing issue of our day, as President Barack Obama, even as we speak, is grappling with the question of America's continued force structure in Afghanistan. But it also speaks to a theme that has been the focus of much provocative programming at Dartmouth in the last year and a half. And that theme is conflict and reconciliation. The Dickey Center has joined with its partners in the Dartmouth Centers Forum, a group of 11 centers and institutes at Dartmouth, to probe the dynamic between our ability to confront the conflicts that plague our existence as individuals, as societies, and as states in an effort to achieve lasting reconciliation with those forces with which we have been in tension. While I'm rather skeptical that today's speaker will provide much hope for us to believe that true reconciliation within Afghanistan is possible in the very near future, there is certainly much to be said about that situation as a continuing source of conflict. And I certainly would like to thank all of our partners in the Dartmouth Centers Forum for selecting today's event as its fall showcase event on the theme Conflict and Reconciliation. As I mentioned, today's speaker is exceptionally well qualified to address the topic of this afternoon, the Re-Talibanization of Afghanistan. As special advisor to U.S. General Stanley McChrystal, the commander of the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan, Ms. Chayes is intimately knowledgeable about the challenges the Allied forces in Afghanistan face with regard to the ongoing insurgency there and the difficulties of rebuilding a country racked by conflict for literally decades. Sarah Chayes comes to her expertise in a rather unique way. Many of us, and I'm sure all of you as well, have come to know her by the distinctive timbre of her voice, which you will soon recognize, as a reporter for National Public Radio, reporting to us from many challenging locations, the Balkans, North Africa, and the Middle East. A history major at Harvard, she served in the Peace Corps in Morocco and then returned to Harvard to earn a master's degree in history and Middle Eastern studies. Operating from Paris, she freelanced for a number of radio and print news outlets and joined National Public Radio in 1996. She is very well known for her reporting in the Balkans, and in fact, her work on the Kosovo War won her the 1999 Foreign Press Club and Sigma Delta Chi awards. In 2002, she left journalism to help rebuild Afghanistan after the fall of the Taliban regime. In Afghanistan, she served as field director for Afghans for Civil Society, a nonprofit group with whom she had worked on a number of reconstruction projects, including, amongst other things, launching a popular radio station. She has run a dairy cooperative and is co-founder of Argand, a cooperative producing fine skincare products from local fruits, nuts, and botanicals, the aim of which is to discourage opium production by helping farmers find legal outlets for their harvests. In 2006, she published a book about Afghanistan since the Taliban entitled The Punishment of Virtue: Inside Afghanistan After the Taliban. Because of her deep connections in Afghanistan, and of course, she is much more embedded than the average journalist ever could have been, she was tapped, as I mentioned earlier, to serve as a special advisor to General Stanley McChrystal this past year, which I believe is a reflection of our military's recognition that success in Afghanistan cannot be achieved only in military terms. Please join me in warmly welcoming Sarah Chayes.
Thank you all very much. That's always a difficult act to follow, like, now what do I say? But I, first of all, want to thank you all for turning out. And I think it always kind of amazes me that in this day and age of television and screens and things like that, that people come to listen to a public lecture like this, and without even any PowerPoint to prove my military credentials or to give you some visual respite. But it's really amazing. And this is a country of ideas and of public exposition of ideas and things like that. And it's a real privilege to be part of that tradition. And also the Dickey Center, I think, is just, from the little that I've seen of it prior to coming today and today, it just is one of these extraordinary institutions, which didn't exist, I think, when I was in college. And one of the things I was talking about in a class earlier today is my own experience with international affairs involved a lot of failure. It involved a lot of going out there and blowing it and coming back and catching my breath and going back out. And I think an institution like the Dickey Center makes that possible because it allows students a chance to go out in a somewhat structured context. And so maybe the failures are a little bit less brutal than they would be otherwise. And so I just am grateful to all of you for your support for the center as expressed by your being here tonight. And to the students who are in the other room for being part of the center. So Ken mentioned a little bit about my trajectory, and I'd just like to add a couple of points, which are that, the Karzais got me into this thing. I was using President Karzai's uncle as one of my background sources for when I was reporting in November, December of 2001. Really interesting guy, very helpful in providing me some of the cultural context that made some of the apparently incomprehensible events, it fit them into a context. And he invited me to dinner. I was leaving. I had passed the baton, and it was January of 2001, and he said, come over for dinner. And we talked for a long time, interestingly, about corruption, which is what is going to be one of the topics tonight. And he was telling me about the NGOs and how they were sharpening their teeth and sharpening their knives to get a piece of the kind of huge flow of development dollars that he saw coming in. And we had a really interesting conversation about this. And I was getting ready to go, and he was helping me on with his code. And this is a Karzai family trait, is they pop the question when you thought the conversation was over. And he said, wouldn't you come back and help us? And I said, yes. I kind of thought with my mouth, which you'll notice is another characteristic of mine. And I said yes before I had even processed the question. And that's how I ended up staying in Afghanistan. And I have, as Ken said, spent that time until March, it was actually General McKiernan who hired me, not General McChrystal, but General McChrystal kept me on. Until March, I've been living in downtown Kandahar with regular folks without barbed wire or sandbags or bodyguards, although we do carry hardware. But I speak Pashto serviceably, not brilliantly, but well enough to live my life and things like that. And so in a way, what I'm still trying to do is part of what I was trying to do as a journalist, which is carry other people's voices to people who need to hear them. And what I've tried to do when I speak publicly or when I've expressed myself about Afghanistan policy is embed myself as much as possible in what I'm hearing from the ordinary Afghans that I live amongst. And that's really who it is. My cooperative is 15 people, men and women, 5 men, 10 women, ordinary people. Of the 15, I think 1 to 3 of them read and write. But they're very sophisticated. We have very sophisticated political conversations because when you're in a country whose destiny is as determined as Afghanistan's is by external politics, you get to be really good at reading the tea leaves and things like that. Sometimes a little too good. You get to believe in conspiracies a bit too much. But anyway, that's the environment from which I'm speaking to you. And what I'd like to start with is a little bit of myth busting, because I think, and it's more evident now that there's finally a national debate about Afghanistan, that there are some analyses that just don't add up to what I've experienced in Afghanistan. And one of them is that Afghans hate foreigners. And this is a trope, Afghans hate foreigners, they reject foreign intervention, they knee-jerk anti-foreigner sentiment. Well, let's start with Alexander, who's one of the guys who, that we always go back to Alexander and how he was defeated in Afghanistan. Well, he was defeated or not defeated, but he encountered stiff resistance in part of Afghanistan. But in Kandahar, for example, which many people believe is named after Alexander, he encountered a wonderful tribe whom he called the Benefactors, and that was one of the reasons he founded a city in Kandahar. He wintered there. It was warm, and that's been a place where rulers of that area have wintered. There was a long period of migratory capitals where the summer capital would be a little further north and the winter capital would be in Kandahar. And, so it's not accurate to say that even that Alexander encountered sort of a monolithic resistance to his arrival. And I entered Kandahar, Mullah Omar's hometown, in December of 2001, a couple of days after the fall of the Taliban regime. And what I can say is that it wasn't like the pictures we saw of Kabul where people were throwing off burqas and lining up to get their faces shaved, but because it's a more sober city than Kabul is, and Kandaharis are cautious and they're conservative and things like that. But what I can tell you is there was 100% support for the arrival of for the impending international involvement, because Afghans are really practical and they understood that they had been cut off from the entire international community for the last 30 years, that they were in a rut, that their vehicle, as it were, was broken down, and that there was no way they were going to be able to winch it out of that rut by themselves, and that international involvement was the way that they were going to be able to enter the community of nations. And what they were really interested in was getting a good government. That's what everyone I talked to mentioned was, wow, you are going to help us get, a government of educated people who are responsive to, the population and stuff like that. And I remember having, and this was an NPR story actually, it was Ramadan, right when the Taliban fell. It was the month of Ramadan. So you would go and break fast with people. And I broke fast one day with a dozen opium dealers. And in fact, in my NPR way was getting sound, so I would ask them to weigh out some of their opium paste. And I was picking up the sound to use in my story. But we got into this conversation about education. And they were, you guys have to bring us schools. You have to bring us schools. And I was doing the tough love thing. And I said, we're not, the United States of America is not going to drop a fully formed educational system out of its helicopters. That's not going to happen. So we need some help from you. What are you going to do about your education system? And we got into it, and we got, and there was one guy who said, I could actually lend out the roof of my house. We could use the roof of my house for a school. And this is what the conversations were like in, December of 2001. So that's one point. Another myth that I keep hearing about Afghanistan is, it's one of these, it's never really been governed. Afghans really don't like to be governed. They're really a tribal people who have never been governed and can't be governed, and why were we trying to bring, Jeffersonian democracy to, the tribesmen? Well, let's see. Afghanistan was founded as a nation in 1747. That beats us by a couple of decades. And it has been governed from that day to this with a greater or lesser degree of central control, but so have we. I mean, let's take a look at what, let's say, Missouri looked like in the 1870s. In other words, I think that again, it's being described in too black and white a way. And I also think that it's interesting if you look at the sourcing of documents that talk about Afghanistan as an irrevocably ungovernable place, you'll notice that the sources either come from the periods when the West was most interested in Afghanistan, which were the 19th century when the Brits were interested in it, and the 1980s when the Soviets were occupying it, because that's when there was a lot of attention on Afghanistan. Well, those are periods when the country is undergoing invasion by an outside power. And those are actually aberrations. They're not, you can't extrapolate those kind of that type of a period as a norm for a country. And so what I would say is that the tribal identity is definitely very strong. And it was something that I picked up on quite early. And I kind of jokingly allied myself with a border tribe, which is called the Achigzais. And I would start making tribal jokes quite quickly. I would ask people what tribe they were from, and when they were from the Nurzais, which was my rival, I would say, we're enemies and stuff like that. And people loved it because they loved that I understood the dynamics that way. But the way I've experienced it is it's more like dual citizenship. And that's something that we can all relate to. I mean, many of the people in this room are proud citizens of the state of New Hampshire. And that is a very strong identity. People feel that they are New Englanders and they're from New Hampshire. And it's even different to be from New Hampshire than to be from Maine. That's a real identity. I'm from Massachusetts, so but that doesn't conflict with your feeling that you are American. We are quite comfortable with the idea of having concurrent identities. And what I would say is if you ask any Afghan that I know, are you a Pashtun or are you an Afghan? It's sort of like asking me, are you an American or do you have green eyes? I don't understand the question because this is not an either or proposition. On the other hand, what's interesting about the tribal identity is that when you are a country, which we aren't, that comes under frequent attack from outside, again, there's a cliche that says Afghans only unite when they come under attack. I actually think it's the reverse, that Afghans, when they come under attack, it's usually the state that comes under attack. The British Raj, installs its puppet king, or whatever it is, or the Soviets almost do the same thing. And what Afghanistan does is it dissolves its national identity and falls back on the tribal structures as a platform for fighting back. So that gives them a real power in the kind of consciousness that needs to be borne in mind, I would say. It's not something that they can entirely afford to give up, because then what happens if their state comes under attack again? And that brings me to a point, again, there's a confusion, I think, in people's minds between a tribal elder and a warlord. And I've often heard people who are, I've often heard those words used interchangeably. And in fact, they're not. What happens is, under normal circumstances, traditional structures are collective decision-making processes. So you've got, every village has its tribal elders, and every village knows who they are. You go into a village and you say, I'd like to sit down with your elders. And 7 people or 6 people or 10 people will show up, and they are generally recognized by the village as being the tribal elders. What turns a tribal elder into a warlord is when they're armed, when there is a monopoly on the use of force, which causes them to basically escape the regulating power of their peers. So normally with tribal elders, it's a collective decision-making process where issues are talked out until a consensus is reached. And again, we've got in America a real tradition of this too. I recommend the book Miracle at Philadelphia about the framing of the American Constitution. And one of the things that really struck me reading this book is that it was a consensus-building process. In other words, we would, if we're the Constitutional Convention, we would, let's say, bring up Article 3 for discussion, and we would debate it, and we would vote. And then we'd leave this auditorium, we'd go out to the bars around Dartmouth, and we would hammer each other and work on each other. And tomorrow we'd bring it back up for a vote. And you could keep bringing the same article up for a vote until you got tired of it. That's how the procedure worked. And that is a consensus-building process, which is a little bit different from our, kind of secret ballot, one person, one vote, one shot deal. But it's equally democratic. It's just a different procedure. So what happens when you overarm tribal elders is that whole process gets sabotaged because one guy is in a position to impose his will. And one time there was a program which got launched kind of on the model of the Iraq awakening, and this was called the Afghan People's Protection Program. And it was a notion of basically giving arms to local people and inducting them into a kind of semi-police. But at first, the idea was, let's just give them weapons and they will defend their towns or their villages. And I talked to a bunch of elders. I asked someone to kind of collect me some elders from this province and asked them what they thought of this program. And I was startled to find that to a man, they were against it. And what one of them said, and I love, and it's delightful to say this to this audience, I love Afghan elders because they are so wise, they are so they're so candid and self-aware. And they say stuff that you'll never find anybody under 30 saying. And one of these guys says, we elders are a powerful force for good, so long as you don't give us guns. If you arm us, we become warlords. And I thought, bravo. And so I'll use a metaphor to kind of describe what I saw, what I conceive, because I wasn't there, to have happened at the period of the Soviet withdrawal. Is, you've had a decade of war in which tribal elders, or even sometimes younger commanders, are being given inordinate amounts of money and weaponry, including Stinger missiles and things like that. I mean, really, and so you have this anomalous picture of a resistance struggle that is being fought from the backs of mules with Stinger missiles. It's that kind of a contrast between where the kind of material culture of the country and the level of weaponry and money that was being poured in. And then the Soviets withdraw, and so what you can think of it as a kind of metastasized cancer. These warlords were like cancer cells that started preying on the body politic because they were too strong for their communities to rein in, just like cancer is too strong for your own body to be able to master and get rid of. And you can think of the arrival of the Taliban in 1994 as it's like your doctor tells you, look, you're going to have to undergo a very painful operation in order to get this cancer out of your body. And the patient says, well, okay, if there's no other way to get the cancer out of my body, I'll have the operation. So the Taliban come, and they literally cut these warlords out of the body politic. They killed them, they exiled them to Pakistan or Iran and things like that. And it's one of the things for which even in 2001, even after, Al-Qaeda kind of hijacked the whole Taliban thing. And please don't think that I'm apologizing for the Taliban or their means of rule. But the one thing for which Afghans that I talked to appreciated them was that they did throw these warlords out of the country. And so then you have 9/11, and you have a kind of rush by the United States of America to do something in Afghanistan. And so we cut some corners. And what we did was we said the enemy of our enemy is our friend. So we basically enlisted these very same warlords, not realizing that not only were they the Taliban's enemy, they were also the enemies of the Afghan people. But we only saw that they were the Taliban's enemy. And we said, great, they'll help us drive the Taliban out. But to continue my metaphor, it was like we took a syringe, sucked up the cancer cells, and re-injected them into the body politic. And it was something that I saw immediately at the time, and actually I got into one of my very rare arguments with my editor at NPR. I wanted to do that story when I, was coming into Kandahar for the first time, because that's what everyone was talking about, was, oh my God, the Americans are bringing the warlords back. And I could tell that this was going to be the defining issue of our tenure in Afghanistan. And I was told that this wasn't interesting and we'd have time to do intra-Afghan quarrels and stuff like that. So that's a lot of what my book is about. It was the story that I wasn't able to tell on NPR. What's great about a book is that you have more than 4 minutes, to tell the story. So surprise, surprise, when you basically re-inject criminals into the body politic, you end up with a very corrupted government system, because we didn't just bring them in as our proxies, we then installed them in positions of power. And so the next myth that I would like to bust is that corruption is endemic and cultural in Afghanistan. What's really interesting to me is I've only heard foreigners tell me that. I haven't heard a single Afghan say, this is normal, this is a normal state of affairs for us. I've heard Afghans from, as I say, November of 2001 screaming about this. This is, in the summer of 2002, I got some young folks together because I was going to start this radio station, and I wanted to kind of do almost like a focus group. What were they interested in having? This was going to be the first private radio station ever in Afghanistan, so I wanted to know what people wanted to listen to. And the conversation quickly turned to matters of security. But this is summer of 2002. There weren't any Taliban. The problem wasn't the Taliban. The problem was the militia that was attached to the governor of the province, whom we had ushered in and imposed in power. And what was even worse, so this militia was basically shaking people down. It was doing just what the warlords did back in the early 1990s. It was shaking people down. It was taking bribes. It was, one of the kids, his cousin, had refused to give up his bicycle and got shot in the leg because, or I had gone to a hospital when there were still some Al-Qaeda guys in the Kandahar hospital to do some Al-Qaeda story. So this is a little prior. We're talking, December 2001. And this kid gets wheeled into the hospital, and I think he was 9 or 10, and he's bleeding. He's got a chunk missing from his upper arm. So what had happened was it was Ramadan, and he saw some of these militia guys smoking, and you can't smoke during the day in Ramadan. And he had said, how come you're breaking your fast? And the soldier just leveled his Kalashnikov and shot the kid in the arm. And these were the people that we ushered back into positions of power without any, again, we've had a lot of discussion recently about counterinsurgency versus counterterrorism. And what I would say is we were so focused on terrorism and so focused on Al-Qaeda that so long as these guys seemed to be giving us intelligence against, terrorist suspects or targets, we didn't really care how they treated the people. So we were just not looking at this stuff because they were helping us. And we didn't understand how, if they drove the people to distraction enough, the people would turn against us because we are now seen as being the force that kind of props these guys up. So what I'd like to say is that there is a redistributive function, again, in traditional Afghan culture, which is that it is up to the tribal elder or the village elders to take care of the weaker and poorer members of their community. And that means that to a large degree, they do have to amass some money in order to be able to redistribute it. Because when people are, people will show up and expect to be fed, or people will actually show up and ask you for money. And it was really interesting once, again, the kind of hero of my book, who unfortunately was blown up in 2005, he became chief of police of Kabul. And I called him, to congratulate him, and I called him another time, and he said, "Do you want some money?" And I said, "What?" He said, "Rupees, do you need some money?" And I said, "No, I don't need any money," But he so felt that was part of his function, he felt that I had been his friend when times were rough for him. And so his first instinct was, what can I do for you materially? What can I do for you? So that does exist as a function, but that's very different from corruption, because corruption money leaves the country. Corruption money builds, fantastic bungalows and palaces in Kabul. There's a whole, I think they call it opium stand or something like that. I mean, there's a neighborhood in Kabul that's all the drug dealers, and you can tell because, there's just no way you could buy these kinds of buildings without it being either opium or corruption money. You have kids who get jobs in the Customs Administration who are suddenly buying $100,000 houses, And tips the same way. There is a cultural, it is culturally appropriate if a government servant does you a favor or goes out of his way to help you out. You ask directions and the cop actually says, let me show you, and gets in your car and shows you. You might give him $1 or something like that. That's not where in our culture that might not be seen as appropriate. That certainly is appropriate in Afghanistan. What's not appropriate is, we're bringing solar panels into Kandahar and we have to pay $130 just in, at every checkpost. What's also not appropriate is, you can't get your goods out of customs without basically paying off the customs agent. And then what he does is he lowers the customs rate. So the Afghan government loses revenue. He gains, it was $900, so it was $770 in customs bribes, right? That is not normal. And so you could call them, it's actually better to think of them as ad hoc taxes rather than bribes or tips. Because a bribe is when I'm the agent and I choose to bribe the official in order to get favorable treatment. When it's extortion, it's not a bribe anymore. And you renew your identity card. It costs you 3 days' labor. They assess these things at the highest level the market will bear. When that police chief was blown up, somebody else, one of his relatives, had come to visit from the States, actually. He was a resident of Albany. And his son had to get a death certificate and had to bribe the police officer to get a death certificate. It's at that kind of level. And then there are two other really important points about it. One that's only crystallized, it is amazing. I've been thinking about this for almost 8 years. And you know what, I am going to do a little drawing so now I'm away from the microphone, but this is systematic. What I want to say is it is not ambient, it's not a cultural kind of phenomenon. This is government as criminal syndicate, and here's how it works. And you know what, this is going to have to be off mic because I'm just going to walk over here. Can you guys hear me at least? Okay, so you have like the central government, or I could put initials that the second one would be a K. It's good that it's off mic. And you've got, like the governor, you've got a judge, you've got a crony, right? And they've got their little pyramids. The governor has, a district chief, and he's got a contractor, like a building contractor, a civil engineer, et cetera, right? And then you've got the people, right, that we're all supposed to be protecting and taking care of. And schematically, in a normal government, taxes go from these guys to the center and then get sent down in budgetary allocations and salaries and stuff like that. This one works the opposite way. The money goes up because this guy bought his job, and he bought it for a lot of money. And this guy is the brother of the president, and he salts away a couple $1 million every couple of months for his brother, and stuff like that. And what goes down is permission to extract all the stuff I was mentioning, the bribes, the traffic in natural resources, development, skimming off development dollars and stuff like that. Protection, like the international community gets really angry about one of these guys, or let's say the governor of a province, and what happens at most is that the governor gets moved to another province. We haven't had a single corrupt governor go to jail. No one's gone to jail. And also, punishment if you don't play along. And this system, and some of these guys, I'm not doing it quite right, but like down here you also have some Taliban, which are really useful to be your enforcement mechanism when you need them. So there are some connections there too. So this system kind of goes like this. Development money, so a lot of it bounces off and comes back here in high salaries and overheads and stuff like that, right? Right? Exactly, US, right? And then you've got a whole lot more that goes to Dubai, right? In, numbered bank accounts and stuff like that. Very little of it comes down here. And guess what? These guys know how much the contracts are for. And so they're pissed off. A lot of people say if let's say 80 cents on the dollar is captured by the system, well, at least the people get 20 cents, so they're better off than they would have been. No, they know that the bridge contract was for $80,000, and they know that only $20,000 was spent on it, and that's why there are already potholes in the bridge, and they're pissed off. And so then what keeps them from rising up in revolt? Here's the really problematic, painful part. The forces. Right? The international forces. There's a 100,000 man enforcement arm for this system. I work for it. I mean, it's not deliberate, but that's how it's worked out because we're partnering with these officials, right? And so we act, how could you stand up in revolt when there's 100,000, troops from the 42 richest and most developed countries in the world? So what do these guys do instead? That's the only way they can really express how, their rage. They join the Taliban. It's the only way that they can actually resist. Enraged people pick up arms. And they're getting more and more angry at us, the international community, because they see us as sustaining this system, as defending the system. And the problem is that we, again, and that's going to be another one of the myths, or you'll see I'll have hopefully already busted it, we have a tendency to see the insurgency as an ideological, religion-based kind of thing. In fact, it's more like an insurrection. But so that as a resistance, as a way of expressing resistance, it's opaque to us because we see this as a religiously based insurgency. We don't see it as being fed by rage at a very secular problem. Now, the next thing I want to point out is that, Afghanistan, one of the poorest countries in the world and stuff like that, so, why are we really worried about this? Well, let me give you a couple of examples. The customs take in the Afghanistan, I know we've got some geographers in the room, so I'm going to take a geographical diversion. You can think of Afghanistan as a wall dividing three major basins of civilization. One is the is Central Asia, one is the Indian subcontinent, and one is the Iranian plateau. And Afghanistan is a wall dividing those three places with an incredible natural resource, which is 2 doors in the wall. You can't get from one of those places to the other without passing through Afghanistan, which means if you're the gatekeeper, which means the most important natural resource Afghanistan has is its roads, right? So customs in the province that contains Jalalabad on the east are something like $10.2 million a month to the Afghan government, except the governor of Jalalabad also has his own private toll booth, and he takes in 60 cents on the dollar. So he's actually taking in about $12 or $13 million a month into his own pocket. Another factoid, the current vice president, one of the current vice presidents of Afghanistan, shipped $52 million in cash out of the Kabul airport a few months ago. Let's look at the copper mine that was a concession given to the Chinese some months ago. I don't know the details, but I do know that a Karzai brother spent a lot of time in China. And I would be shocked, given China's behavior in other resource-rich places like Africa, I would be shocked if there was not a multi-million-dollar kickback that went. So again, the government is taking in less money than it ought to. You know, that's the deal, is, oh, I'll only charge you, $500 million for this copper mine instead of $2 billion, but you also have to pay me, 10 or 20 million. Something like that. I don't know what the order of magnitude is, but I know that's how these kinds of concessions work. So we're talking about, how could Afghanistan sustain an expansion of its security forces? Well, there are some really serious reasons why when the President of the United States calls President Karzai and says, you really need to do something about corruption, that those words need to be backed up by constraints. And you'll see as we continue this afternoon that I'm not in the camp that says, oh my God, it's so terribly corrupt, we should just leave. No, I'm saying look at the resources that are there. This is doable. This is doable. There's resources to float this thing. The Afghan population objects to this. We've got everything we need to make this work if we can just apply the right pressure and things like that. So that's the fourth myth that I wanted to bust, is that this is a profoundly ideological issue. I have never met a population, and I've spent a lot of time in a lot of different countries, I have never met a population more practical than Afghans. The poor folks, they've been through a communist revolution, an Islamicist revolution, now they're going through some kind of, democratic whatever. They're vaccinated, like they've had it with ideology. And as you see, the real issue here is supremely practical. And there's some historical examples. It's quite interesting. During the Soviet occupation in the 1980s, there were a number of different anti-Soviet resistance groups. The way it worked is that we provided our support for the resistance via Pakistan because it was the Cold War and it wouldn't have looked too good for us to be directly supporting a group that was fighting Soviets and stuff like that. There was, a minor nuclear issue to be avoided. But basically, Pakistan got a blank check in terms of which of the groups it gave our money to. And 2 of them, of the 7, were leaning toward extremism, and the other 5 weren't. And interestingly, the Pakistani government chose one of these most extremist groups called Hizb Islami to give basically half the money, roughly, that we provided to Pakistan went to Hizb Islami. And remember, those were in the days that folks thought that religious ideology was maybe a good antidote to communism, and so let's stoke up religious ideology, and see if that helps. So I don't think there were a lot of quarrels from the United States with that policy, but that's how it went. And then what was really interesting is that the Soviets withdrew, and Pakistan pushed Hizb Islami to try to take over the country. And interestingly, part of the post-Soviet civil war was about Afghanistan not wanting to be ruled by an extremist, fundamentalist leader. And so all the other factions fought back against him. And it was only after 4 or 5 years of desperate, chaotic civil war that Afghans so exhausted by that experience sort of, and then presented with the Taliban as an alternative to that experience, kind of threw up their hands and said, okay, well, it's better than this. So this is not a conflict that has its roots in an ideological basis. What I would say, though, is that I've heard the language starting to change in the last couple of years. These are the only complaints. The complaints that I'm hearing are complaints about this kind of thing. But I have started to hear language morphing into a more ideological sounding vocabulary. I started hearing the Karzai government called an infidel government, about 2 years ago. And I think that's because, ironically, and in spite of the reputation that Afghans have of rejecting authority, it is actually quite difficult for them to reject authority. And so they have to come up with they have to sort of go nuclear. And they have to come up with a rationale that trumps everything else. And the one rationale that trumps everything is a religious rationale. So you're hearing the language take more and more religious overtones. But the underlying grievances that I'm hearing are these ones. So let me finally arrive at the subject that is the title of this talk, which is how then, in this context, does Afghanistan get re-Talibanized? The first step was the deliberate reconstitution of the Taliban and its insertion into Afghanistan by the Pakistani military. So the way I see this is starting late 2002. It really wasn't an insurgency at all. It was an invasion of Afghanistan by proxy. And again, it was our obsessive focus on terrorism that caused us, the United States, to overlook this. And I watched it happening. It was fascinating. We're now all hearing about how Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is going to be tried in federal court in New York. He was delivered to us by the Pakistanis. And I saw it, if you go back to 2002 and 2003, you'll see a well-timed delivery of an al-Qaeda operative about every 3 or 4 months. And it bought us off because that's what we were obsessed with. And one time I actually had, the famous actionable intelligence on not Mullah Omar, but the next rank down. There's like a group of 6 or 10. 6 more like. And I had one of them down to license plate numbers and one of his safe houses in Quetta, Pakistan and stuff like that. And I took it to the embassy. And literally I was told, yeah, I know, Sarah, but there's nothing we can do about it. They just gave us Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. So that was overlooked until it got really, really bad. So you'll also hear that things were fine until about 2006. Wrong. I watched it deteriorating starting late 2002, and it was a jagged kind of thing. But the environment has grown. So in the beginning, there was total rejection. You could feel it. It was being inserted in, and people would come in, to do a hit and then leave again. There was no foothold for them inside Afghanistan because they had been thoroughly rejected by the population. But the more people got frustrated with this system, the more permeable they became to, pockets of Taliban maybe staying behind and stuff like that. And you add to it some of the unfortunate civilian casualty incidents and, military convoys blasting through town and knocking people off of roads and what are called escalation of force incidents when somebody comes close to a vehicle and the military shoot in the air and the guy doesn't understand and so then they shoot him. This stuff starts to happen, and I actually think there was a fair amount of tolerance for that. I mean, Afghans do understand war, and they did understand the difference between how we were behaving and how the Soviets behaved. But as they lived through year after year after year of this, it's like, well, what is it for? How come the people who are stealing the money aren't getting raided in the middle of the night, but my cousin, who didn't do anything, got raided in the middle of the night? And so more and more frustration and sense of injustice led to people becoming increasingly receptive to the penetration by the Taliban. Now, that being said, it is, I mean, they are still not popular even in southern Afghanistan. I mean, even in their heartland, they are not popular. They are getting some grudging, wow, they're braver than, or not even that on some of the governance things. Their justice. I've heard some grudging approval of how they're settling, in particular, civil cases. So again, it's not people lopping off hands, it's land disputes mostly. But there's a lot of coercion. And I watched, I'll give you the sort of story of a very key district immediately north of Kandahar city. And this place is called Arghandab, and my cooperative is sort of named for it because it's a pomegranate forest. It's the most amazing place. Kandahar is kind of like the moon with some goats on it and stuff like that, then there's this ridge of very rocky spine of hills north of Kandahar, and you go over that spine of hills, and suddenly you're in a pomegranate forest. And it's an army's nightmare. It's sort of like Normandy in World War II. You've got trees, and you've got irrigation ditches, and there are walled orchards, and the orchards are tangled, and there's a meandering river that goes through it, and it's the place you don't want an insurgency to get bedded down because it's going to take napalm to get them out of there, And indeed, that's where the resistance drove the Soviets out of southern Afghanistan from. And so this place had been loyal to President Karzai, mostly because the tribal elder that held most sway over it and who had been the commander with the Stinger missiles during the resistance was a friend of President Karzai's. And he was a friend of mine, too. And he was a historic figure. It's like an oak tree. And he, out of kind of personal loyalty, he was keeping it loyal to the government. And the Taliban tried to kill him they had their sights set on this district because it dominates Kandahar and because of the terrain and stuff like that, and the symbolic value. And they tried to kill him in March of 2007 and failed, but because he was in a bulletproof car that Karzai had given him, actually. But his son was killed, and his other son had to have a leg amputated, and he was injured and stuff like that. And he went to India to convalesce, and when he came back that fall, I went to see him, and it was really heartbreaking because, again, he was a chapter in Afghan history, and when I went to see him, I knew that chapter had ended, that it was over for him, that he could not believe that the place, after everything that had happened, and now the whole international community was invested in Afghanistan, and still it was failing. And he couldn't even go back to Arghandab, his district, anymore. It was too dangerous for him. And the thought of that man who had driven the Soviets out of southern Afghanistan from that district, no longer even being able to go there, it was so heartbreaking. And then it was the major festival in October, and I had this I know what it was. It was the end of Ramadan. And when Ramadan ends, there are like 2 or 3 days of holiday when everyone goes around to visit all their people. And you visit your tribal elders, you visit your family and your extended family, and it's a kind of retying of bonds. It's a really lovely tradition where you kind of pledge your fealty again, and you reach out and touch your whole extended human environment. And I knew that he was going to be totally swamped because everyone was going to come from districts all around. And so I just said, I have to see Mullah Naqib tonight because then it's going to be the end of Ramadan and I'll never be able to get near him. And I went to see him, and it was really funny, too, because I would wear men's clothes. And Afghan homes are divided. There's the receiving side, which is in front, where men receive men. And then the back part of the house is the private part of the house where you are with your women folk. And as a female, of course, I would go into the back of his house, but I forgot that I was wearing men's clothes. And I went back into the back of his house, and he's not shouting out at me, which is what he normally does. And I stopped, and I asked him, do I have permission? He goes, oh, it's Sarah, Khodai Dirawala, welcome, blah, 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 and all of that. And some of his guys out front, and then he said, I thought you were a pretty boy. Which has all of the connotations that you guys obviously are expressing. And so we had a lovely time. I mean, he was quite upset with the way things were going, and he was saying the Taliban are nothing. I mean, they're nothing. I don't understand what's going on. And I said, well, the government ain't so great itself. And he said, yeah, the government isn't too good either. And he was, well, he died that night of a heart attack. And within 2 weeks, the Taliban attacked Arghandab district. I mean, it was absolutely predictable. And what they did, it was fascinating to watch. They attacked ISAF, responded after a couple of days, and drove them out. And they withdrew. It was a fighting withdrawal, which is a relatively difficult maneuver to execute militarily. And what I came to understand is that in the ISAF, in the military biz, see, I'm learning all the acronyms and stuff like that. It's called IO, Information Operations, or STRATCOM, Strategic Communications. And we claim that STRATCOM is this is a war of ideas, and STRATCOM is the most important part, and all this stuff. But in fact, we fundamentally conduct military operations with strategic communications as supporting elements. The Taliban, it's the other way around. Their military operations are their strategic communications. They were not there to conquer Arghandab district. They were there to drive fear and uncertainty into the hearts of the residents. And so they didn't mind withdrawing. So they withdrew. ISAF, patted itself on the back. We drove them out and all this stuff and went back to their bases and everything like that. And then the Taliban spent the winter intimidating people. And it was really interesting how they did it. They went for the elders first. And they would kidnap them, kill one, beat another, send them all back to tell a village, you shouldn't work with the government or with any NGOs or with the international military. And they did that all winter long. And it kind of softened the environment. And then the next summer, the summer of 2008, the same thing happened. And some of you may have remembered hearing about a big prison break in Kandahar in the summer of 2008. That was a big event. And it was, Taliban attack on the prison, and they blew the doors down, and they released 1,000 prisoners into the wilderness and all this stuff, and it was very spectacular. And it so happens that the prison is south and west of town, and the prisoners ran south. And so ISAF focused all its attention south and west. And the next thing that happened was there was another attack on Arghandab, which is to the north of the city. And I am convinced that prison break was a feint. It's a classic. And I then went asking a lot of the old resistance fighters, did you guys ever do feints? Oh, yeah, we did it all the time. We do a fake attack over there when we really were aiming over there and all that stuff. So, second attack on Arghandab. This time it took ISAF 4 days to get its act together to repel the Taliban from Arghandab. And then they did the same thing, intimidation and coercion. But the next layer down, then it was like the baker who had sold some bread to the police checkpoint. And that really hits home. You're a pomegranate farmer, and if they kill a government worker, you can always say, oh, well, that's not me. I don't work for the government. I just, cultivate my pomegranates. But when it's your next door neighbor who's a baker, that really has an impact on your behavior. And you're going to think twice about interacting with the police and stuff like that. So now, one of my cooperative members who's from that district, he went home to visit his pomegranate orchard about a month ago. And he saw a place where there had been an improvised bomb that blew up a police vehicle. And it was recent enough that the police vehicle was still there with all the pieces of the bodies and and all this stuff. And there was somebody that he was sure was a Talib kind of standing watch over the site. And then there was a police checkpost a couple hundred yards in the other direction. And he said, I walked right past that police checkpost because if I had stopped, first of all, there was the Talib behind me who might have seen it. Second of all, I don't know if there aren't some other Talibs hidden in the other trees ahead of me. Third of all, I don't know if that police officer isn't a Talib. And I endanger myself by stopping to tell the police about the Talib behind me. And he wouldn't do it, because so that's how you start to achieve control over a population, is you start controlling their freedom of movement, if you will. And that's one of the first things that starts to happen, is they put in checkpoints where they stop everyone and they frisk them. And for example, they confiscate their phones that have the camera functions. So in another village that another one of my cooperative members is from, they have a telephone tree where all of the confiscated telephones get broken and hung up from the tree. And so there are about 150 or 200 telephones hanging from the tree. And first they'll do mobile checkpoints. So they'll be there for an hour and then they'll disappear and stuff like that. And one mark of them gaining more control over the population is when they can keep the checkpoints up. So that's one thing. And then they gather, it's again in phases. They start collecting money. So it's really interesting. This system is not interested in taxing the population because taxation would have to go into government coffers, right? They're not interested in governing or in having a national budget. So they don't tax. The Afghan government doesn't tax, but the Taliban do. And the way it works is first they just ask for donations. That's when they haven't really established control over an area. They go into a mosque, they say, you know, next week we're going to come and gather some donations from you. And they come with their shawls, and they put the shawls down, and they ask people. And you kind of have to. You can't get out of the mosque without, but you put however much you want. And then the next phase is, you know, this young man over here looks quite well heeled. You know, we're going to ask for, you know, $500. Whereas immediately on his right, you know, we're going to be a little bit nicer and only ask for $50, you know. It'll be like that. They will judge how much money a person can afford to give. Then the next phase is straight up taxation, 10% of your income. And what's really scary to people is they know. So another one of my cooperative members, his older brother, tried to undervalue his grape harvest. They said, you didn't only take in, you know, 500 tons. You took, or whatever, I can't remember the, you took in 600. And that's another big difference distinction that people make between us and the Taliban, is they say the Taliban know us. And of course, it's easier for them because they're Afghans, and so they live amongst the people, and they have much better intelligence, frankly. Freedom of movement, taxation, judicial function. And as I said, it's more civil cases than criminal cases. And now it's to the point in Kandahar where they have what's called a ticket. And in Pashto, it's called a ticket. And if I'm a plaintiff, I'll go to the judge, and he gives me a ticket that I can bring to the defendant, the person that I'm angry at or that I have a case against. And that guy will come. And the reason they'll come is now the Taliban will make good on threats against people. And so they have a coercive power, even in Kandahar city. And so people show up for these court cases. And what's happened is that this system, see the guy in the middle is a judge. This system, you can't win a court case under the Afghan government without paying off the judge. It's just not possible. And, you know, both sides usually pay him off, and then it's the guy who pays more or who's more of a crony of the judge, et cetera. And so the Taliban are the first people who are offering any kind of justice, frankly, for people who are disenfranchised. Because they're the only ones who have a coercive power against the guy who's a crony of the judge. I mean, against the guy who's plugged into the government or who has a lot of money. Now, it's also being used, I've noticed it being used by people with longstanding land disputes against people who are currently siding with the government. So it's also being instrumentalized, you know. Someone will get denounced, and it just so happens that he's being denounced by his next door neighbor who has a claim on his land. But at the same time, what I'd say is that, you know, so there's coercion, intimidation and stuff like that, but there's also nothing to adhere to on the other side. And what I would say is that the one lesson to be drawn from counterinsurgencies past is that when the government doesn't have a political project the population can adhere to, the counterinsurgency loses. You lose if you don't have a political project people can be proud of. And I think, you know, just to reiterate, I think that has a lot to do with why this thing is spreading. The final thing I want to say is that it's been interesting to watch in the South. The progression that I was describing to you doesn't necessarily involve a lot of attacks on us. But we tend to count attacks on us as a mark of Taliban advance. And so you may have heard of Helmand province, where there are now a lot of US Marines. It's actually a less important place than Kandahar province for historical reasons. Kandahar was the first capital of Afghanistan, and it's where it was basically the Taliban capital, and so it's a kind of national and religious capital at the same time. But we got distracted by all the attacks against us in Helmand. So it seemed like there's more activity there, so it kind of drew our attention. And there was a period this spring when there were 10 times the forces in Helmand that there were in Kandahar, whereas I would have argued that Kandahar was in fact more deeply under Taliban domination, because the kinds of processes that I'm describing to you sometimes happen under the radar. And same thing, we can talk about the election, and I could actually talk for as many hours as I've already talked to you about the election, and we may get into that in questions. But one of the really interesting things was, at first there was a kind of cry of victory because there weren't too many attacks during the election, on election day. And my answer was, but the Taliban's objective was not to conduct attacks. The Taliban's objective was to shut down the election, and they did. Because where they owned ground, like I'm saying, I mean, this district, Arghandab district, now belongs to the Taliban, along with 12 other of the 17 districts in Kandahar province. And so in those districts, they didn't have to do any attacks. All they had to do was tell people, if you go outside your house today, you're going to die. And whether people would actually die or not, they were scared enough, and they're survivors enough, to say, I'm not going to risk it, because there's nothing at stake in this election that makes it worth it for me to see if they're telling the truth. And especially if I have to put ink on my finger, you know, where I'm going to be marked out for the next 3 days as somebody who went out and voted. So nobody voted in 13 out of 17 districts in Kandahar province, which is part of how you're able to do industrial strength fraud. Because when you have 13 districts where no one votes, but the polling places are open, and therefore the ballot boxes are empty, that makes it really easy to stuff the ballot boxes. And that's exactly how it worked. And we can get into that if you're interested. But the point was, they didn't have to do a lot of military attacks. There didn't have to be a lot of flashbang if they can basically shut down the election through intimidation and things like that. So it's been a more quiet advance in Kandahar province. I'm not saying it's been quiet, but quieter than maybe in Helmand. So I finally come to the end of my notes, and we can turn this into a discussion. But there are a couple of things that I want to point out as conclusions. One is that, you know, the old dichotomy between realism and idealism in foreign policy. What I would say is that realism fails, because what we have been doing for the last 8 years has been a realist policy of, let's just focus on al-Qaeda and let's not care about social justice. Well, what that got us was a vastly expanded reservoir of al-Qaeda and Taliban operatives, right? And the second point is, which is related to the first, is counterterrorism as a strategy fails. In 2002, there was no sanctuary. There was like one tiny little mountaintop in Tora Bora was a potential sanctuary for terrorists. Now you've got 30 to 40% of the country owned by the Taliban, who are deeply in cahoots with al-Qaeda still. And so the notion that al-Qaeda somehow respects the Pakistani border and only exists in Pakistan is a fallacy, let me tell you. And so the notion that you can just focus on al-Qaeda bases and that's the end of terrorism, and not, you know, and somehow have a hermetic distinction between the Taliban and al-Qaeda also fails. So those are, I think, 2 points to bear in mind as we think as a nation in the next couple of days and weeks about what our policy is going to look like. I think those are 2 important points to bear in mind. So with that, I would like to hear from you guys, but I think some students are going to come into the room. There's a question back there who's going to get a microphone. But
as is our practice, we'll call on students first, and if there are students in the overflow area, come on back in, because there's seats. Yeah, there are lots of seats now. So We have microphones circulating around, so please, when you ask a question, wait till the microphone arrives. There's a question back here.
The gentleman standing up with a question who needs a microphone.
Yeah, there you go, Jasmine.
Is this on? First, I wanted to say thanks. I thought the analysis was really refreshing.
Thank you.
And so my question is, you were saying when you're drawing all the the cycle on the board that the coalition forces were kind of continuing the cycle, and then you said that they could exert pressures to reduce the cycle, and I was just wondering what those pressures were.
Yeah, the first pressure, and it goes back to this sort of, if you help us fight the terrorists, we don't care what you do. You have to start caring what else they do. So I've experienced, in Kandahar, and in this particular case, Canada has been until just recently the lead nation in Kandahar. And so it was Canadian military. And I'd be sitting in the governor's majlis, which is his sort of office hours, to use student terminology. But it's where he does kind of business in a public fashion. And it's a really interesting, again, this sort of goes back to the traditional consensus building kind of thing. One way of solving problems and disciplining people is to do it publicly. And so I would go and have an issue to raise with the governor. And you'd have, 15 people seated around the room. And what he would do is he would say, sir, what's your issue? And you would start telling your story. And about 2 minutes into it, he'd stop you. And then he'd ask this gentleman over here, well, what are you here for? And you'd get into yours. And then he'd go back to you. And, and it's a way of making the whole thing public. And so people would start participating in the issue that issues that other people were raising and things like that. And this would come screeching to a halt when the Canadian officers would come in with their maps under their arms. And he'd go off into a private room and he'd talk about some military operation with them. And the thing is that immediately raised his stature in the eyes of all the people who are in the room because he's got military might. And so that right there makes him invincible and not susceptible to checks and balances because he's got the might of us behind him, right? And so the issue that I was bringing to him was one that I heard about because I found out there was an manufacturers union in Kandahar. And it was like, wow, well, I'm a manufacturer. I'm going to start going to manufacturers union meetings. And I could not believe the number of obstacles that the provincial officials were putting in the place of productive economic activity. I mean, there were a couple. One was electricity. And so there was decent electricity and crappy electricity that was coming into the city. There was crappy electricity from the hydroelectric dam, and there was decent electricity from the diesel-powered generators. And that decent electricity was going to a neighborhood peopled by the governor's cronies, and the crappy electricity was going to everyone else. Now, when you have a factory and you've got, this thing, it would go between 110 to 240, randomly, like this. Imagine running machinery on something. And then it would stop randomly for 15 or 20 minutes and come back on. And that was before we got to where we only had about 1 day in 4 of electricity and stuff like that. So it's impossible to run machinery. So it's impossible to have factories. So it's impossible to employ people and stuff like that. And that was one issue. Customs was built, the customs regime was designed to penalize manufacturing in Afghanistan to the benefit of manufacturing in Pakistan because there was a higher tariff on raw material than on manufactured goods. Imagine that one. That one we decided that has to be handled in Kabul, so I can't get the governor to do that. But it was either the electricity or the other one was land in the industrial zone for people to build factories. And this industrial zone had been improved with USAID funding. And the manufacturers, but the provincial government was saying, you guys just build your factories and then we'll decide on the prices. It was like, no. And so I go to talk to the governor. He says, I don't want to talk about electricity. I said, you have to. You're the governor. This is your job. You have to talk about electricity. And he said, okay, I'll call you tomorrow. I said, no. And I, I'm a girl, so I could kind of jolly it up and stuff like that. So I went to his desk and took his calendar off his desk. And I turned the page and I said, "You're free at 11 o'clock tomorrow. I'll be here." So I wrote myself into his calendar. And I brought the manufacturers. And it took 15 months to get it sorted. But we got it sorted just by my continuing to harass him every time it stalled out. And so what I'm saying is one way that the military and civilian, and what I was stunned is, why am I doing this? Like, there are officials here. How come, And so one way to do it is just raise the issue. And a lot of people say, well, why should the military raise these issues? And my answer is, they're the strongest tribe in Afghanistan. And that matters. In other words, most civilian officials look something like me, except, with not as much elderly aspect in their hair. In other words, they're 34-year-old females. And I'm sorry, but you take an Afghan governor and you take, a brigadier general or a 34-year-old female with, and the brigadier general is saying, "Come help me mount this military operation." And the 34-year-old female is saying, "Now, Mr. Governor." Which one is he going to listen to? So you have to have the military raising these issues because it's a power dynamic and they're the ones being listened to. So that's one thing. But what I would actually say, and again, I've got a lot of these stories, as you can see, and I can, for anyone who's interested, I can take you, this is a very vertically integrated system. There has been one corruption arrest. It happened on October 19th. President Karzai himself interfered with the serving of a search warrant. That is how vertically integrated this system is. And it's because of the protection. It's because of this P. If he fails to provide protection all the way down the line, the whole system crumbles. And he's probably in more danger from the other members of this system than he is from us. So let's look back at, so there's a certain amount that you can do on the ground by using our leverage in ways that we haven't up until now. For this arrest to happen, a 2-star general in ISAF had to go and talk to the interior minister because he was interested in not having this arrest happen. So when you've got a system where if it's President Karzai getting into the weeds of a search warrant, that means that you're at the ambassador of the United States and or General McChrystal, who would have to intervene because if it's at the presidential level, that's who can intervene. So if you're talking about having the U.S. ambassador and or the commander of ISAF have to go in to make sure a search warrant gets served, you're looking at the prospect of death by 1,000 paper cuts. You can't do that every day. And so let's look at a couple of other recent pieces of history. The president of the United States calls President Karzai when he's declared the victor of the recent elections and says, "Congratulations, Mr. President, but, you've got some work to do. I really need you to work on this." And the next day, the president of Afghanistan gets up at a press conference flanked by a war criminal on either side of him and says, "Yeah, I'll work on corruption, but it's not really a question of removing corrupt officials. It's really a question of the legal framework." Let's see. I think Afghan law says that you're not allowed to forge 1.2 million votes. But he did it, and he's the president. So I don't think the legal framework is the issue. In other words, what he did in the Afghan messaging system is tell these guys, that middle P holds. I'm not going to be removing you. That was a very clear message to the other members of this system. It was also a pretty clear message to the President of the United States. Like, bug off, And so I actually think that that's very, very important, and we have to pay attention to this kind of messaging. And this is a country of very subtle power dynamics. And what he was doing was challenging what the President of the United States said. And I think that it's very important for the U.S. government to come back hard and say, "Oh, really? I don't think you really understood what we're saying." And there's a lot of development money that, as I pointed out, is going into people's private pockets. So let's start making our development money contingent on natural resource concessions, which could bring billions into the Afghan national budget. development money not being captured and things like this. So let's go back to another recent event, which was the deployment of almost all of our diplomatic might to get President Karzai to accept having to stand for a second round. Now, my feeling is that we deployed that effort for the wrong objective. That what really needed to happen, because there was materially no way to organize a second round of the election in conditions that would have reduced the fraud, the likelihood of fraud. You couldn't, there was a catch-22, which was in a place like Kandahar, as I said, 13 out of 17 districts, you can't vote. It's not possible to vote. Therefore, polling places should never have been opened. Because it's materially impossible for people to vote. So you shouldn't be pretending that people are enfranchised when they're not. But then if you don't have open polling places, then you have a disenfranchised population. So that's the catch-22. If you don't open the polling places, then physically and materially, 20 to 30% of the population is disenfranchised. If you do open the polling places and the Independent Election Commission and all the governors in the key places are part of the Karzai machine, then you're going to get fraud. So there was no way to hold a second round. So what we should have done, I think, is blown the whistle and said, whoa, time out. This isn't going to work. And to use a sports metaphor, I'm a resident of France when I'm not in Afghanistan. And, the Tour de France is a wonderful sporting event that has been plagued by violations of the rules called performance-enhancing drugs. Well, when you use performance-enhancing drugs and you're caught doing it on a stage of the Tour de France, your score doesn't get reduced, by the points that you earned on that stage. You get kicked out of the race. So it was perfectly acceptable. I mean, it was within Afghan law for the Electoral Complaints Commission to throw Karzai out of the race for forging more than 1 million votes, right? So I think that that's the perspective that we should have addressed the post-electoral period with, which is, look, the, Electoral Complaints Commission is within its rights to throw you out of the race. If you're not going to be thrown out of the race, here's what's going to happen. And what would need to happen is some kind of a mechanism that provides constraints for good behavior. As we've seen, we pull out all of the diplomatic stops, and President Karzai grudgingly accepts that he should do what the law obliges him to do, which was accept a second round. That doesn't constrain his behavior in the future. That actually got us nowhere. We don't have a situation where the Afghan government is going to be more responsive to the needs of its people. We can still, I think, step in if we've got the courage, the moral courage to do it, which is to say, President Karzai, I think you didn't hear me properly on the phone. I think that you need to come to America and let's have, for example, a Dayton. Let's have a retreat with a couple of, the key members of this system and a couple of the key troublemakers in the opposition. And first, there's some messaging about it is really serious that not only is the United States not obliged to stay in Afghanistan, it's very difficult politically for this government to do so. It's very difficult. I mean, so some changes have to happen. And so that message needs to be made very, very clear. Because for the moment, President Karzai thinks we're obliged to stay and thinks that we're dependent on him. And then what you do is you create some constraints. And what I would do, there are various permutations and combinations, but what I would do is set up a kind of council of elders, and it could be the 3 runners-up, for example. It could be Abdullah, Ashraf Ghani, and Bashar Dost, who were the 3 runners-up, and then 3 internationals of enormous stature, like Al Gore, or King Abdullah of Jordan, or Juan Carlos, or there's a whole club of Madrid, former chiefs of state who are willing to keep, applying themselves for the greater good of humanity and stuff like that. Let's get 3 of them. And what I would do is I would well, I would use the retreat to hammer out this famous compact that supposedly President Karzai is going to announce with the Afghan people. But I would make it very, very concrete with deliverables and a timetable and stuff like that. And then the Council of Elders monitors compliance. And three other major issues is dual key access to three things. One is the natural resource concessions, because, again, Afghanistan's poor, but the copper mine, there's an iron ore mine that's about to be concession sold to the Chinese again. There's emeralds, rubies, carnelians, marble, timber, several hundred post-industrial minerals under those mountains. And so, this is serious money. It may not be oil, but there's other stuff than oil in the world. And also dual key access to development resources. You put them all in a pot. You constrain us a little bit. We don't get to just do, USAID doing its white elephant projects wherever it wants to. Let's put it all in a pot. And then have dual key access to finance ministry and this Council of Elders. And the third thing is appointments. Because there's another thing, this model explained a lot of stuff that I had been seeing and not quite understanding over the last number of years. And another thing that it explains is this famous notion that, well, they're all corrupt. Everyone, it's a cultural thing. We don't see any government officials who aren't corrupt. Well, guess why? A mafia system selects for criminality. You're not going to find anyone who's not corrupt inside the system because they've been picked off by the third P, or they've been, corrupted, or whatever it may be. So you have to start looking outside the system for talented people, and there are tons of them out there who have either been in government in the first year or two and gotten discouraged, or weren't in government, because they didn't trust it, or whatever it might be. But those slates of candidates need to be, I think, proposed by something like this Council of Elders, because President Karzai, over the last 8 years, it's been proven that he has been appointing people who conform to this system. That was a very, very long answer to a... There's one back there.
Speaking of corruption and looking to the UN, you speak to Peter Galbraith's argument with the UN's action about the election.
Yeah, Peter Galbraith and the UN behavior in the election. I would say, I have to be a little diplomatic myself here, but I would say that the United Nations is a diplomatic, or UNAMA is a diplomatic organization. It is not, it's kind of don't ask, don't tell kind of organization. It does not raise, major issues with how it partners with government officials. And so, without having seen a lot of the internal workings in the United Nations, I can say that I didn't see a lot of people objecting to the way this election was going to be run. But what I can say is it's not the UN only that's to blame. I think that's my phone, so if you want to turn it off, sorry about that. Yeah, right. What I would say is I bought 10 voter registration cards in April. You could buy these things on the open market. And, I knew exactly what was going to happen. And I would wave these around, including to Peter Galbraith, I have to say. And I did not get a rise out of anybody, out of the U.S. Embassy, out of Richard Holbrooke, out of, Tim Carney, who was the guy sent out to do the elections. And I just couldn't get anyone to focus on this issue. And frankly, that's not the military command's place to be, intrusive. This was a political issue, and I just could not get any of the civilians who were charged with looking at this. And my feeling was what it was about was our kind of American obsession with results. And so what I kept hearing was, well, Karzai's he's going to get elected anyway, or who's a viable challenger, or who should, and I was like, that's irrelevant. What's important is that there be a modicum of credibility to the process, because then even if Karzai is returned to power, at least people will have some notion that maybe it's going to look different this time around. Whereas when a guy forges 1 million votes, the Afghan population has its worst suspicions confirmed. You know, that this is what he's like, and the international community isn't going to do anything about it, because that's really what happened. And so I actually think the dereliction was not just in the United Nations. I think it was all the way across the civilian diplomatic community. I think we wanted to focus on students. Was there? Yeah. Oh, you're kidding. Whoops. 1, 2, 1, 2. Yeah, there are 2 students with microphones. Right. Okay, number 1 there and number 2 there. Number 1 right there.
So in this context, in this room, I think you're very convincing in laying out the issues and problems and possible solutions, but I'm very curious about whether the military and McChrystal is listening to you with open ears, and whether they're changing their approach at all, and how receptive they've been.
I've seen enormous changes, and I have to say, you know, Sally the soap maker gives an ops brief, right? I mean, for somebody like me to be a full-time employee in a military headquarters is in and of itself a real tribute, I think, to how far the U.S. military has come in the last 8 years. Because I don't think it, you know, I've at times been sort of persona non grata on the base in Kandahar when back, you know, like before it was NATO. And I was sought out. It was actually General McKiernan, General McChrystal's predecessor, who hired me. And I had come up to headquarters and basically given him a hard time about his pet project 3 different times. And finally he said, you know, Sarah, I need you to do this to me more than once a month. You know, and I thought, damn, that's pretty cool. And so I won't say that I'm not an irritant. And sometimes I feel like cod liver oil, like, you know, like they know that I'm good for them, but they really, you know, or they hate the taste of me, but they know I'm good for them. And it depends. Different officers react differently. But just recently I was in General McChrystal's office, and I thanked him for his tolerance, because I'm a pain in the neck. And he said, this is what you're paid for. You keep throwing grenades. And what I would say is that, particularly on some of these issues, it wasn't that comfortable to, like, especially again for the military, to focus on things like this. And again, being aware that these are folks who have come out of Iraq. And Iraq was I think, psychologically very, very, very profound experience for those officers who led the kind of reversal of fortunes in 2007, because they arrived in a period that was utter hell, when you were having 10, 15, 20 bodies fetching up on street corners every single morning. And they approached it differently. There was a change that was already happening in Iraq, and they kind of rode that wave. They encouraged it and things like that. And an apparent miracle took place. And so I think it's really, really understandable for people to be so marked by that experience that they look for parallels when they come to a new place. And so I do think there has been a tendency initially by some of these folks to say, you know, it's about arming local communities. It's about more troops to get the troop density up to where you can just tamp down the violence the way you would tamp down a fire, and then other things can flourish, other flowers can bloom. So when I tell them, but if you don't grapple with this, you're going to get more violence, it's hard for them at first to wrap their minds around that. And so we had a lot of debates. But I think if you look at the initial assessment that was, you know, printed in the Washington Post, you will see an extraordinary statement, which is we're facing 2 threats. One is a violent insurgency, and the other is a crisis in confidence in the government caused by that. That's a revolutionary statement for a military headquarters to make. And so what I would say is that I'm very appreciative of the hearing that I get in the military. I think that's how I would answer that.
You've talked a lot about how the corruption and a lot of the problems in governance come from top down and come from Karzai and the central government. So my question is, why does the United States continue to emphasize a centralization of power as opposed to a more kind of federalistic system where you empower governors and you empower like the local level people to elect their own elders or elect their own governors and have them, control the aid dollars, control the police, control the, local military operations, control the future of at least their own principality or locality, as opposed to everything being decided by, someone who, as you've mentioned, doesn't have any legitimate popular mandate?
I would say two things. One is that there's a big move afoot to focus much more precisely in the directions that you're talking about on what's called subnational governance, and that hasn't made it into common lexicon because every time I write it, I get the little red squiggly line in the computer. But there is a lot of that. And it's one of the things that Abdullah made a hallmark of his presidential campaign is devolution of power. I would put some caveats on it for a couple of reasons. One is who appoints the governors? You can't focus on subnational governance in a system that is as vertically integrated as this one currently is. Secondly is that let's take a look at recent elections. What's even worse, if there was anything even more corrupted than the national election, it was the elections for provincial councils. So when you're in a situation where you can't preserve the integrity of the electoral process, you're not going to get true representation out of elections. And thirdly, there's a real tribal problem. Interestingly, a lot of the Afghans, I would say the majority of Afghans that I've discussed this with, actually don't want locally elected public officials because they're afraid of the tyranny of the majority. They're afraid of local officials who are so plugged into the tribal dynamics of their areas that they end up exacerbating the kind of splits among the different people. And they actually like the principle of appointed governors because their notion is those governors will be more neutral. The problem is that system got distorted by this. But it's a very good question. Thank you all very, very much indeed.